Hi, I'm Clyde Haberman. Welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. I'll be filling in for Sam Roberts. On Tuesday this week, Mayor Eric Adams delivered his first State of the City address at King's Theater in Brooklyn. At the top of his proposed budget is an increase in police funding, but he also touched on other priorities like funding to help alleviate homelessness, improve child care aid, and provide for affordable housing. At the same time, Mayor Adams has faced increased scrutiny over some of the hires he's made for his administration. In a story that came out this week, as reported on by my first two guests, the mayor may be, well, let's just say, garnering some unwanted attention for bringing onto the city payroll some people with questionable backgrounds. And so, welcome to you both, Metro reporters Dana Rubinstein and Jeffrey Mays. But before we get to any of that, we have to deal with the Court of Appeals and the redistricting ruling, which, in case you folks didn't know, basically knocked out New York State's plans for redistricting congressional seats, and a special master is going to have to take over. And how much of a monkey wrench does this throw into everything?
Oh, I think huge, don't you? And it has national implications because New York Democrats were hoping to pick up some congressional seats to help the Dems, retain their majority in Congress. And now that's all thrown into disarray. And people have been running in districts that may no longer exist.
Right.
And we won't really know for, I guess, a little less than a month what the new districts look like.
The voting now may be pushed till August?
Yes.
Why would we want voting in August when, if any normalcy returns, the city empties out to a large degree? Maybe the whole state doesn't empty out.
Well, I mean, that's one of the questions people are asking about this ruling. How's it going to affect the turnout? New York already has historically low turnouts on a regular basis. But again, I think the bigger question, like Dana said, is how are these districts going to shape out now? People have spent months and money formulating their strategies around the lines of the district and the messages, and now that is all going to have to reshift for some candidates.
I assume this is almost, does this amount to a Nicole Malliotakis rescue plan, in effect?
It may well be, yeah. This is very good for her. I mean, she was facing the prospect of running in Park Slope,
right,
which is kind of,
where she might get 6 votes, yeah.
Right, it's hard to think of a neighborhood more ill-matched for her politics. So this could be very good for her, depending on how the district is redrawn.
How much were National Democrats, I should say, counting on New York to offset the losses that they're expecting everywhere?
It seems like they were counting on Dems to pick up a couple seats here. So, every couple seats counts quite a bit when you have such thin margins. Yeah,
exactly. To switch to the state, do we have a sense yet of how badly Governor Hochul has been hurt by the forced resignation amid corruption charges of her Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin?
Yeah, I think it's a devastating blow for her. It was, selecting Brian Benjamin was really like her first major decision when she took over for Governor Cuomo, and her promise was to take the state in a new direction away from sort of any allegations or hint of corruption that sort of surrounded the former governor. And we've seen that has not been the case. It seems that they badly misjudged, made a lot of poor decisions, ignored signs that were already out there about Brian Benjamin's fundraising and campaign spending.
But do we have a sense yet of whether it has already hurt her? Do we know this, or are we just assuming?
No, I think it's thrown her campaign into a little bit of disarray, right?
Yeah.
She has to, doesn't have a running mate now. She may be stuck with a lieutenant governor, not of her choosing. And
could we go into the mechanics of that? I mean, can she get him off the ballot, especially if the election is not till August, perhaps?
Well, to get him off the ballot, he's got to either die or move out of state.
And he seems to be wanting to do neither of those.
Seems pretty young and healthy. And I think he has resisted the move to get him to relocate.
Right.
And so she has asked the legislature to pass legislation allowing for him to be moved off the ballot. But the legislature doesn't seem particularly inclined to give her that, or at least they're not inclined to give her that without some sort of significant concession.
Which might be what?
God, I have no idea,
Okay,
but it seems like they're quite upset with her about both that they were forced to sort of roll back some of the bail reform efforts and also the huge Buffalo Bills subsidies.
That stadium is,
Yeah, so I think there's not much love lost right now.
Guys, you've been following New York politics for a while. What is it about the culture of New York politics that leads to one major official after another being forced to quit or winding up in jail even? I mean, just within the last year, obviously we have Mr. Benjamin gone, we have Mr. Cuomo gone, but there's a long roster of Elliot Spitzer and Schneiderman and Alan Hevesy. I could go on. Is there something wrong with us?
I know. I think
Apparently.
That's a good question. Yeah, we have a record here. I think what happens, I think the voter turnout is part of that. Incumbents, once you're an incumbent, you're almost guaranteed a victory in any number of offices from city council to governor. So I think that's part of the problem. Even Governor Cuomo, retained popularity even after the allegations against him. So I think that's part of the problem is the voter engagement.
Is it worse here than in other states? I mean, I'm sure it's worse than some other states, but surely this is an American phenomenon, not just a New York phenomenon.
I think so, right? I also think the political corruption is an American phenomenon, not a New York phenomenon, right? Illinois has quite a record.
That is true.
And I don't know much about
Governor
Blagojevich, yeah.
I'm pronouncing his name wrong.
I don't know much about state politics elsewhere, but I have to assume it has everything to do with money in politics and the people who self-select to go into politics and the personality types that, want to be the center of attention and accrue power.
Well, it's just shocking. The lineup of folks who've been basically frog marched out of office is extraordinary.
Yeah.
To stick with Governor Hochul for a second, Jeff, you had a story recently that she's not doing as well among African American voters as she would hope, and certainly not as well as she does among whites and Latinos. Is that significant? I mean, does this really hurt her against Tom Suozzi and Jumaane Williams, who are running against her in the Democratic primary?
Well, this may not hurt her as much in the primary because she clearly has a strong lead over both those candidates. One is running to her left, the other is running to her right. Jumaane Williams has struggled to raise money at all, to really make much noise in this campaign. The problem comes in the general election. Black voters are a strong base for the Democratic Party. There doesn't seem to be a lot of excitement for Governor Hochul right now. Part of the reason is she's from upstate Buffalo. People don't really know her. She has to do a better job of getting out, talking to people, getting known by voters. I think she's doing that now with the budget pass. She's going to be out doing more retail politics, sort of trumping some of the accomplishments she had in the budget. But I can tell you that people around her, Democratic strategists, people in her campaign are really worried that if she does not have a strong showing among the base and say there is some sort of red wave in November, that could be problematic.
It's been a long time since a Republican obviously has won statewide office, but is it feasible this year?
It's hard to tell.
I'll emphasize on the word feasible.
Yeah,
I'm not predicting it, but
it's hard to tell. Who knows what kind of campaign Lee Zeldin is going to, or the likely nominee is going to run. But certainly there's a risk anytime that there's a sort of depression in the turnout. And it's not just New York, it is also a national issue. You see this with President Biden and his approval ratings, that just sort of a lack of excitement among the Democratic base.
And the Republicans have really seized on concerns about crime in a very effective way. I mean, whether or not those concerns are based in real numbers, I mean, it's not really relevant, but they've seized on the emotions surrounding it, and it seems like they've been so effective that they've gotten a Democratic-controlled legislature and governor to roll back bail reform,
Right, fair enough. Turning to Mayor Adams, he did have his State of the City speech this week. Here, just a very broad question of how he's doing now. It's 4 months that he's been in office. And touching on what I alluded to in the introduction, some of his appointments are of people who have various bigotries in their past and troubles. Is this a case of the mayor being a forgiving soul, or the mayor being incredibly tone deaf? They may not be mutually exclusive, those two things. I'm not sure.
I mean, I think the mayor would argue that he's a very forgiving soul, that he has been through tough things in his past, and it would be hypocritical of him to not allow other people to have second chances.
Okay, there's a but coming here somewhere.
Well, you know, other people, critics would argue that we live in a city of 9 million people, and if you have someone you like, who you feel loyal to, but who might bring unwanted attention to you and your governance and prove a distraction, maybe you find one of those other 9 million people who is similarly or more qualified and elevate them instead. It's an unusual situation.
Yeah, I think regardless of how you feel about Mayor Adams, we just have to acknowledge that he took office at an incredibly difficult time. Sure. It was in the middle of a surge of the coronavirus pandemic, and then we've seen some sort of horrible public crimes, you know, people being pushed on the subway, 2 police officers being killed, horrific fires. So it's been a very dramatic period, and I think the big concern about some of these appointments is that people feel that it's just a distraction from him being able to focus on sort of these fundamental issues. He's made some big promises in terms of how he's going to govern, that he's going to focus on sort of poorer New Yorkers and help uplift them while also tackling crime, which is a sort of promise that is sort of difficult to walk that line without damaging the very people you say you're going to help. So I think people see these appointments as a possible distraction. And this is New York City, right? He's right. The CEO of a $100 billion corporation. There must be lots of people that want to do these positions.
I sometimes wonder, are these kinds of concerns the focus of journalists that maybe average readers of newspapers and average voters really don't care that much about, whether or not somebody made homophobic remarks, you know, once upon a time or even recently? I mean, are we in our business different from everybody else in this regard?
We might be, but if you believe that these potentially problematic appointments could distract the mayor from tackling effectively the challenges that Jeff outlined, and you see that in, you know, an inability to control crime or an inability to reform the police or, you know, any other sort of campaign promise, I think people do care.
Well, he doesn't strike me as a person who's overly burdened by self-doubt, so I think we can we can assume that. And about his taxes, which have tax day has come and gone. I paid mine. Is there just a credibility issue that lingers over, you know, where does he live? Does he pay his taxes and all that? Why does he almost invite this kind of?
I mean, he's promised transparency. You know, he's repeatedly said he's going to be very transparent. You know, questions about where you live, questions about your taxes, what you own. You know, those are things that I think the public should be concerned about and interested in. The past 4 or 5 mayors have all disclosed their taxes, right, including Mayor Bloomberg, who's a billionaire.
Right. Well,
had
roughly.
To devise
Yeah.
a system.
Or at least their
you know, he deposed. You know, he exposed some information. So I don't see why the expectation shouldn't be there for Mayor Adams to do the same.
Fair enough. We'll see if he does release. We'll wait on it. Thank you, Dana and Jeff. Next up, January 6th and beyond. Welcome back to the New York Times Close Up. The January 6th riots at the Capitol continue to reverberate throughout the country. The committee investigating those events continues to interview people, and people who stormed the Capitol are being found guilty of crimes. Information continues to come out about how lawmakers worked with the White House in an attempt to overturn the 2020 election results by instigating the Capitol rioters. Our next guest, Jonathan Martin, is a national political correspondent based in Washington. And next week, the book he co-authored with Alexander Burns will be out. It's called This Will Not Pass: Trump, Biden, and the Battle for America's Future. It covers not only the 2020 election, but the year that followed in the Biden White House. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Clyde.
What I really want to ask you first is why you have the Oxford comma in your title, but I'll leave that for another day. I'm one of these guys who has yet to accept the Oxford comma. But
I love it.
But to get to something a little more serious, perhaps, you and Alex Burns had a blockbuster revelation in this that we all learned about this past week, that Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, and other Republicans basically said they've had it with Donald Trump. They want him out immediately. He should resign. And then they backed away. Plain and simple, why? And is this just simply a question of them being invertebrates, i.e. spineless?
I think, Clyde, they're taking the temperature of their voters. And a lot of these House Republicans come from heavily conservative districts where there's deep support for President Trump. And I don't think it's more complicated than politicians who are following the lead of their constituents and sort of bowing to what they believe is the preference of their constituents. And because of that, McCarthy is being deferential to his members who are coming from these conservative districts. And so McCarthy is trying to keep his own path to the speakership. And in doing so, that means bowing to President Trump. We've seen it time and time again ever since January 6th, Clyde. And I think our book goes into great depth capturing the walk back to the former president in the weeks and months after the 6th.
How worried is the leadership, the Republican leadership in Congress, both Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell, about the more radical members of their own party, some of whom, from where I sit, are frankly off the wall?
I think they're very concerned, but in McCarthy's case, he largely muzzles his concern because he wants to get a majority of the conference to vote for him for speaker next year. He's not willing to alienate some of those far-right members. And this is a raw political calculation on his part. He covets the speakership, and he's determined to do what it takes to attain that goal. And I think, Clyde, McCarthy has a history here. He sought the speakership a few years ago and fell short, in part because he did not have the affection of the far right in his caucus. He has learned that lesson with gusto. It's a little bit more complicated, Clyde, with McConnell because the nature of the Senate is different. Kevin McCarthy has this line that the Senate is a country club and the House is a truck stop. And so I think because of that, the sort of nature of McConnell's caucus gives him a little more leeway when it comes to Trump. But McConnell's approach to Trump has basically been just not saying anything at all since the 6th, just sort of, going mute, Clyde.
From where you sit, is a Republican retaking of Congress, perhaps both houses, an inevitability?
Look, I think certainly at the House level, it is very likely at this stage of the campaign cycle that Republicans are going to take back the House. There's just a lot of vulnerable Democrats out there who I think are going to be sort of potentially dragged down with President Biden, given the president's dismal approval ratings. I think the Senate's a little bit more uncertain, Clyde, just because the Senate and Gov races typically are judged by the candidates therein. There's a little bit more vetting. There's more knowledge among the electorate about the nature of the candidates. And so if the Republicans nominate some flawed candidates, that could complicate their effort. But I think today, certainly in the Senate, the Republicans are also positioned to take the majority, if not as easily as the House. I mean, look, all they have to do is net one seat, right? Because the Senate's evenly divided.
Absolutely. Is there a level of shamelessness about our national politics that we've just not seen in a long time?
No, it's a really good question. And I think about this all the time. There's always been a level of cynicism in politics, no matter what level we're talking about, local, city, state, federal. It does, though, feel like that there's a more open cynicism now, that it's just there's less winking and nodding. I mean, the fact that Kevin McCarthy flatly denied our reporting, and then it was proven to be a liar, and there's just, most of his party just moves on. They just don't view it as that important, even though his integrity obviously is now at least uncertain, shall I say. And I think that's partly President Trump and his experience and his influence. I think it's partly just the sort of culture changing. But I think you're right. It does feel more raw. It does feel more out in the open, the cynicism.
I must say, the McCarthy thing reinforces for me a sense that the Republican Party in particular is a Marxist party. And I'm thinking of Chico Marx in this, who said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And there you were. You guys had him on tape.
Right.
And yet he denied saying it. Why, to turn to President Biden,
Sure.
why is he doing so poorly in the polls? I mean, one could argue that the economy is getting back on track, imperfectly, of course. He finally got us out of Afghanistan, although that was messy, as we know. Is he undeservedly attacked? I'm not asking for your opinion, an editorial type thing, but
he's paying a price for a pretty sour electorate. Americans have been struggling with COVID and the impact of COVID now for some time. The stop and start on the restrictions, and I think then the impact on inflation, they're just sort of not in a good place right now. And sour voters take out their anger on the party in power. I think the other element here, Clyde, is that a lot of voters were just voting against Donald Trump. And I think Biden was a good enough vessel to replace Trump. But now Biden, judged in his own right, obviously does not have the benefit of being compared to Trump. And I think he suffers from that. Clyde, Biden himself has this great saying that I think he credits to Kevin White, the old mayor of Boston, who used to say, "Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative." And I think Biden really, really hopes that voters do that. But to do that, he's got to present the alternative and sort of highlight what Republican retaking Congress would mean. And he just doesn't do that very consistently, Clyde. And one of the things in our book we talk about is just the frustrations Democrats have in trying to get Biden to drive a message consistently.
Right.
And he just doesn't seem capable of doing that, even when there's not a land war in Europe going on, which obviously takes a lot of his time and attention.
How does he deal then with some members of his own party, like Joe Manchin, who strikes me as being an indefatigable subversive? Is there any way of reaching somebody like Manchin if you're Joe Biden?
Manchin has been there when the party has needed him on some key votes, like he voted to confirm the new Supreme Court Justice Jackson. He voted against repealing the Affordable Care Act. He voted against the Trump tax cuts, and obviously, most memorably, he supplied the key vote on Biden's stimulus bill in March of 2021. So he is there on some key moments, but he certainly is a tough date. He can be stubborn. He can be maddening. The metaphor I often hear on the Capitol Hill, Clyde, is it's like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. He's just sort of slippery every day. That's just the nature of who he is. But yeah, it's a frustration. I think cinema too. Biden refers to them oftentimes as, when you've got 50 votes in the Senate, every senator is a president. And so President Manchin, President Sinema, it's just a fact of life, Clyde.
2024 is the nomination, the Republican nomination, Trump's for the taking.
I think we've got extraordinary uncertainty in both political parties, the level of which I can't remember in modern American history, where we're 2 years out from a presidential election. And A, it's uncertain that the incumbent president is going to seek re-election.
Right.
And B, that it's completely plausible that the former most recent president who was defeated is going to try to come back and run for a second non-consecutive term. Just think about those two possibilities for a second. This is really uncharted territory. And I think politics the next year and a half is going to be fascinating. And I'm thrilled to cover it.
Well, you should be. I think the U.S. president, late 19th century, Grover Cleveland, had two non-consecutive terms.
He did. He's the only one who did it, who came back and won a second term. So Trump would be the second one to do it. I just can't recall when you had such uncertainty in both parties simultaneously about who their standard bearer could be in the next election. And it's going to be an extraordinary period here, potentially of succession and generational change. I'm not sure of that, but I think it's possible.
Right. One more question as time runs down. How the professionals you speak to, how concerned are they just about the frailty or strengths of American democracy, having just had a president whose grasp of traditional democratic values is meager at best, and of course what happened on January 6th last year? Are they harbingers of perhaps even worse to come?
No, that's the fear, that January 6th wasn't the culmination, Clyde. It was the beginning. And I hear that all the time. And I think that's why it's important and, in fact, imperative that the American voters are vigilant and guard democracy and elect people who are going to do the same in both parties. And, the polarization that we're faced with in this country has really gotten to a out of control level that does threaten the health of democracy. The possibilities of political violence have not been this real in my lifetime here, and so it's a very tense moment. I can just tell you from being in the Capitol a lot for this book the last 2 years, Clyde, spending time in the Capitol, it's a tense place. People are on edge. They fear a repeat of some kind of January 6th, and the two parties are deeply suspicious of each other. So these are fraught times indeed. And I'm sorry to end on that very sobering note.
No, but it's an important note. And thank you. And thanks to Jonathan Martin from D.C.
Thank you, Clyde. Nice to see you.
For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman.